Hey everyone, I'm the productivity accountant, and this is where productivity meets purpose. My goal is to help you become more productive by mastering the software skills professionals use every day. So whether you're an accountant, analyst, business professional, or simply looking to sharpen your Excel skills, you're in the right place. Now, let's get into today's video. Have you ever been scrolling through an Excel spreadsheet and suddenly realized, wait, what column am I even looking at? You scroll back to the top, find the headers, scroll back down. A few seconds later, you have to do it all over again. It doesn't seem like a big deal. But if you're doing that dozens of times a day, those few seconds start adding up. Now imagine you're reviewing a financial report with over 5,000 rows, an employee payroll file, a customer database, or an inventory spreadsheet. Constantly scrolling back to the top isn't just annoying. It slows you down, and in some cases, it can even lead to mistakes. When I first started working in accounting, I remember opening some client spreadsheets that seemed endless. Thousands of rows, dozens of columns. I would scroll down trying to review transactions, only to completely forget which column contained the invoice number, which one contained the amount, and which one contained the account description. I'd scroll back to the top, find my place, scroll back down, then repeat the entire process 5 minutes later. It wasn't difficult. It was just inefficient. There's a feature built into Excel that solves this problem in seconds. Actually, there are two. One is called freeze panes. The other is called split. Most people learn freeze panes, but very few people understand when to use split or why both features exist. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly when to use each one, and you'll probably save yourself a lot of unnecessary scrolling. Before we jump into Excel, let's think about something for a second. Imagine reading a book, but every time you turn the page, the chapter title disappeared. You'd constantly have to flip back just to remind yourself where you were. That would get frustrating pretty quickly. That's essentially what happens in Excel. Your column headers are like chapter titles. They give context to everything underneath them. Once those headers disappear, the numbers below them lose meaning. Is this revenue, expenses, employee ID, invoice number? Without context, even the correct data becomes harder to understand. That's exactly why professional Excel users rely on freeze panes. It keeps the important information visible, so your eyes can stay focused on your work instead of constantly searching for where you are. And later in this video, I'm going to show you another feature called Split that can completely change the way you analyze large spreadsheets. It's one of those tools that many people overlook until they see it in action. So, let's take it to the big screen. I'll first show you how freeze panes works, then we'll look at Split, and finally I'll show you when each feature makes the most sense in real-world situations. All right, let's take it to the big screen. Here's the spreadsheet we're going to be working with today. Nothing too fancy. We have employee information, names, departments, hire dates, salaries, and a few other columns. Now, if your spreadsheet only had 10 or 15 rows, you probably wouldn't think much about freeze panes. Everything fits on one screen. Life is good, but that's not usually what happens at work. Most of the spreadsheets I worked with in accounting had hundreds, sometimes thousands, of rows. And that's where this feature becomes incredibly valuable. Watch what happens. I'm going to start scrolling down. Notice anything? Our column headers disappeared. Now I'm looking at all this information, but I have no idea which column is which. Is this the employee ID, the department, the salary, the hire date? I could scroll all the way back to the top, find my headers, and then scroll back down. But if I have to do that 50 times today, that's 50 interruptions. That never needed to happen. So let's fix it. Up at the top of Excel, select the View tab. Over on the right, you'll see Freeze Panes. When you click it, Excel gives you 3 options. Let's start with the simplest one. Freeze top row immediately. You'll notice a thin gray line appears underneath the first row. That line tells you the row above it is now frozen. Now watch what happens. No matter how far I scroll, my headers stay exactly where they are. That means I always know what each column represents. Simple, but incredibly useful. Here's something interesting. Most people think freeze panes is only useful for accountants. Not even close. Imagine you're in human resources, reviewing employee records, sales, looking through customer orders, operations, tracking inventory, marketing, reviewing campaign data, finance, working with budgets. Pretty much anyone who spends time in Excel can benefit from this feature. Now let's look at the second option. I'll scroll back to the top, go back to View, Freeze Panes, and this time, I'll choose Freeze First Column. Now, instead of locking the top row, Excel locks the first column. Watch what happens when I scroll across. The first column stays visible, even though the rest of the spreadsheet moves. Why would that matter? Let's say your first column contains employee names, customer IDs, or invoice numbers. As you move across 20 or 30 columns of data, you'll always know which record you're looking at. It's like having a name tag that follows each row, wherever you go. Now here's where many people stop learning freeze panes, but this is actually the feature I use the most. Let's say, I don't just want the top row, and I don't just want the first column. I want both. Maybe I want to keep my employee names visible, while also keeping my headers visible. Excel can absolutely do that. Here's how. First, I'm going to remove the current freeze, go back to View, Freeze Panes, and choose Unfreeze Panes. Now pay close attention, because this next step is the one people usually miss. Instead of selecting the row, or selecting the column, click the cell directly below the row you want to freeze, and directly to the right of the column you want to freeze. Think of that cell as the dividing line. Everything above that cell and everything to the left of that cell will stay locked in place. For this example, I'm clicking cell B2. That tells Excel, freeze row 1 and freeze column A. Now I'll go back to View, Freeze Panes, and this time I'll choose the first option, Freeze Panes. Watch this. Now the headers stay visible, the employee names stay visible, and I can move anywhere in the spreadsheet without losing my place. This is the version of Freeze Panes I probably use more than any other. Here's a quick productivity tip. Before you freeze anything, ask yourself one question. What information do I always need to see? Usually, it's the headers. Sometimes, it's the first column. Sometimes, it's both. If you answer that question first, choosing the right Freeze Panes option becomes incredibly easy. So, now that you've seen how Freeze Panes works, let's look at another feature that often gets overlooked. It's called Split. At first glance, Split might seem similar to Freeze Panes. Both help you navigate large spreadsheets. Both change the way you view your worksheet. But here's the important difference. Freeze Panes locks part of your worksheet in place. Split lets you view different parts of the same worksheet at the same time. Those are two very different jobs. Let's see what I mean. Right next to Freeze Panes, you'll notice another button called Split. Let's click it. Immediately, you'll notice something changed. Instead of freezing anything, Excel placed a horizontal divider across the worksheet. Now watch what happens. I'll scroll the bottom section, while leaving the top exactly where it is. Notice that? The top of the worksheet doesn't move, only the bottom section scrolls. Think about how useful that could be. Imagine you're reviewing a budget. At the top, you have your annual totals. Farther down, you have hundreds of individual transactions. Instead of constantly scrolling back and forth, you can leave your totals visible while reviewing the details below. You're seeing two different parts of the same worksheet at the same time. Now let's try something different. I'm going to remove the split by clicking the split button again. This time, instead of selecting a row, I'm going to select a column, then I'll choose Split. Now we have a vertical split. Watch what happens. I can scroll the columns on the right without moving the columns on the left. Why would you do this? Imagine column A contains employee names, but the information you need is all the way over in column X. Without Split, you'd constantly scroll back and forth, trying to remember which employee you're looking at. With Split, you can keep the employee names visible on one side while reviewing information farther across the worksheet. It's like having two windows, looking at the exact same spreadsheet. Now, let me show you something that a lot of Excel users don't realize. You aren't limited to a horizontal split or a vertical split. You can actually create both at the same time. I'll click somewhere in the middle of the worksheet and then choose Split. Now look at the screen. Instead of 2 viewing areas, we have 4. Each section can scroll independently. To be honest, I don't use this option very often. For smaller worksheets, it can feel like overkill. But if you're working with extremely large data sets, or you're comparing information from multiple sections of the same worksheet, it can be incredibly useful. The important thing to remember is this: split doesn't change your data. It doesn't move your cells. It doesn't create duplicates. It simply changes how you view your worksheet. Think of it like opening multiple windows that all happen to be looking at the exact same file. Now here's a question I get all the time. Should I use freeze panes or split? The answer is, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you always want your headers visible, use freeze panes. If you always want the first column visible, use freeze panes. If you need both, freeze panes is still your best choice. But if you're comparing information from two different parts of the worksheet, or you need to reference one section while working in another, that's when split really shines. One feature keeps information locked in place. The other gives you multiple viewpoints. They're solving different problems. Here's a quick workplace example. Let's say your manager asks you to compare January sales with December sales. Both sections are hundreds of rows apart. Instead of scrolling up, scrolling down, trying to remember numbers, and scrolling back again, use split. Now you can see both sections at the same time. Now that you've seen both freeze panes and split, let me leave you with a few professional tips that can make working in Excel even smoother. The first tip is simple, but it's one I see people overlook all the time. Before you freeze anything, take a few seconds to organize your worksheet. Make sure your headers are in the correct row. Check that there aren't any blank rows above your data. If you're planning to freeze multiple rows or columns, verify you're selecting the correct cell before clicking freeze panes. Remember, Excel freezes everything above the selected cell and everything to the left of it. Choosing the wrong cell is probably the most common mistake people make. Here's another tip. If freeze panes suddenly doesn't seem to be working, don't panic. It usually isn't Excel. It's usually because the worksheet was already frozen, or because you're in a different worksheet than you thought. Whenever something doesn't look right, go back to the View tab, click Freeze Panes, select Unfreeze Panes, and start over. 9 times out of 10, that solves the problem. Now here's a productivity habit I recommend developing. Whenever someone sends you a large spreadsheet, don't immediately start scrolling. Instead, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself, what information do I need to keep visible? If the answer is, my headers, use freeze panes. If it's, I need to compare two different sections, use split. Taking just a few seconds to set up your worksheet can save you several minutes over the course of your day. And if you work in Excel every day, those minutes add up quickly. One thing I've learned throughout my accounting career is that becoming more productive usually isn't about learning one huge trick. It's about learning dozens of small ones. Features like freeze panes, split, keyboard shortcuts, tables, pivot tables, conditional formatting. None of them are revolutionary on their own. But together, they make a tremendous difference. They help you spend less time fighting with Excel and more time thinking about the work that actually matters. That's one of the biggest differences you'll notice between someone who's just starting out and someone who's been using Excel professionally for years. Experienced users aren't necessarily clicking faster. They're simply removing unnecessary steps. Every click they eliminate, every scroll they avoid, every repetitive task they automate gives them more time to focus on solving problems. And that's really what productivity is all about. It's not working harder. It's creating systems that allow you to work smarter. So here's a challenge for you. The next time you open a large spreadsheet, don't just start scrolling. Take 30 seconds and decide whether freeze panes or split would make that worksheet easier to navigate. It's a small habit, but I think you'll be surprised by how much smoother your workflow becomes. If you found this video helpful, I'd love for you to put what you learned into practice today. The best way to remember a new Excel skill is to use it immediately. Open one of your own spreadsheets, experiment with freeze panes, try split, and see which one fits the way you work. The more you practice, the more natural these tools become. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to subscribe. Here on The Productivity Accountant, we don't just learn software, we learn how professionals use software to become more productive, solve real workplace problems, and continue growing throughout their careers. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about mastering Excel, it's about building skills that move your career forward. I'm the Productivity Accountant, and this channel is where productivity meets purpose. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.